back to a new episode of Analyzing the Apocalypse. We're continuing to talk about the seven churches of Revelation, and we're resuming in chapter 2, starting with verse 8 of that chapter, talking now about the church in Smyrna. Let's talk a little bit about the city of Smyrna so we understand the background for this place. I'll tell you right off the bat that we don't have a lot of information about this place, but what we do know is what we'd expect for a city from this period and in this region. So in this particular case, we have the city of Smyrna, which is to the northwest of Ephesus, and it's there on the Mediterranean shore, much like Ephesus itself is. And it's a major seaport as a result, and one thing that does make it unique compared to Ephesus in that respect is that the eastern road that was coming in from places like India or China would pass through Smyrna and then onward into Europe from there. But as I mentioned, we don't know much about Smyrna as far as the church is concerned, because there's just not a lot of information about it in the New Testament. A lot of people theorize that maybe during Paul's stay in the city of Ephesus, which you recall was over 2 years, that maybe during that time, that's when the church in Smyrna was established. We don't know that with certainty, but that's a good possibility. What we do know is that by the 2nd century, so after the New Testament was completed and really the whole Bible at that point was completed, we do know that the Smyrnian church was a thriving place. There were a lot of prominent names and figures that were there. Perhaps you've heard the name Polycarp. He was associated with this congregation as just one example. So while we don't know a lot about it in the 1st century, we know a little bit more in the 2nd century, but Revelation gives us some background also on the city of Smyrna and what was taking place there among the brethren who lived there. Now, as the tagline says on our slideshow here, the church in Smyrna was a persecuted church. They were facing intense backlash, as all of the 7 churches were in different areas, but we see with Smyrna that it really seems a little more intense than it would have been in other places. So let's go ahead, before we go any further to talk about the text itself, let's just read the text for what it is. Again, we're in Revelation chapter 2, and we're going to be starting in verse 8, and then we're going to read down to verse 11. It's a brief section, so it won't take us too long, and then we'll talk about the meaning of what is written here. So join me in Revelation chapter 2, starting with verse 8. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These things says the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. I know your works, tribulation, and poverty, but you are rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. We already talked about it in our previous discussion, but I did want to point out one thing about the structure of this that is a little bit different from what we saw in our previous discussion about Ephesus. It follows basically the same format. So you remember we have this introduction here in verse 8, which is going to be the church that's being addressed. It's also going to have an introduction from Jesus himself, describing himself in different ways. We're going to see that he commends the church in verse 9 there, except in this case, you'll notice there's no condemnation of this congregation. So with Ephesus, we saw an interesting dynamic where they had a lot of good going on. They were people who couldn't be deceived, we remember. But they had a problem where they had left their first love. And Jesus warns them and says that they needed to repent of that and get back on track, lest they lose their lampstand, which basically, as we talked about, meant that they would no longer have the fellowship of Jesus. But here, in this case, we don't see that. There is no condemnation. There is no warning. In fact, what we see here is an encouragement. And it's telling them that they're going to be tested. They're going to face persecution, and it's going to get worse and worse, but they're not going to be forsaken. But there is that promise there in verse 11, as we talked about in our previous discussion in chapter 2 and verse 7 about Ephesus. There's always a promise at the end of these letters that the one who listens to this message and responds to it appropriately through obedience, they will receive something that Jesus specifies. And in this case, it would be not being hurt by the second death. So I just want to mention that as far as the structure of this is concerned. So we are keeping in mind that there is a structure to this and that these all follow a similar pattern. But in this particular case, the unique feature is there is no condemnation. There's only commendation, or that is, Jesus praises this congregation and says nothing negative about them. So having read the text, let's go back to our slideshow. And let's talk now about what Jesus says concerning this church in Smyrna. We'll start off in verse 8 with his introduction to this church. He says that he is the first and the last who was dead and came to life. Now you'll notice in verse 8 there is this mention here by Jesus about living and dying. And in verse 11, you'll notice there's a mention there of death, specifically of overcoming the second death. So you're seeing in this particular case an emphasis on suffering, an emphasis on living and dying, because, again, this is a persecuted church. It's likely the stakes were so high that they were going to be dying, that they would face martyrdom for the name of Jesus, so it makes sense why Jesus would introduce himself this way. But the point is that they can overcome this, that this is temporary, that this is not going to last forever, that they can, through Jesus, overcome and be faithful. So verse 9 is where Jesus praises this congregation for what they've been doing. He says, just like he told Ephesus, I know your works, your tribulation, and your poverty, and in parentheses, but you are rich. That's an important detail to focus on. So Jesus is already aware of what's taking place among the brethren here in Smyrna, like he was of those in Ephesus. He knows about their works. He knows the good things they're doing. He knows their suffering. He knows their poverty, which seems to be a reference to physical poverty, because notice in the parentheses there you have, but you are rich. So he's talking about their spiritual condition being rich, but their physical condition was poverty. We'll talk more about this when we get to the church in Thyatira, because it has a bit more relevance there. But there is a strong possibility that poverty had struck this congregation because they were being locked out of the market in the community because they were Christians. There was, in many cases in Asia Minor, that if you did not have certain religious affiliations, you could not work, you could not trade in the market. There was a lot of restrictions placed upon you as a result of your faith, and that had tangible repercussions to it. You were punished as a result of not going along with the imperial cult, or that is worshiping the Roman emperor as a god, or worshiping any number of false gods that were being paraded about. So if you didn't do those things, you were seen as an outcast, and you were treated like one in the economy, and you couldn't support yourself or your family. But despite their physical poverty, despite the fact they didn't have a lot of money, they were being locked out of opportunities potentially, Jesus says, you are rich. And that is the estimation of Jesus for these brethren, not their estimation of themselves or even the world's estimation of them. Because what matters here in this particular case is their faithfulness, which is rich indeed. He notes here something in verse 9 that we really need to talk about. He talks about how he knows the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. This could very easily be misread, and I don't normally mention things like this, but especially in a modern political climate, this can be quite problematic. And just saying that phrase at the end of verse 9 could easily have it be labeled as anti-Semitism. The Bible is not doing that. That's not what's in view here. What's in view here is the idea that these Jews who call themselves Jews, who see themselves as part of the Jewish religion, who see themselves as the only ones faithful to God, they have become a persecuting power against the church. And the idea that they're a synagogue of Satan is simply a reference to the fact that, like Satan, they are opposing the work of God. But it's not commenting on ethnicity. It's not commenting on doing anything to these people. It's just mentioning what they're doing and what they have done and the position in which they have placed themselves. We're going to see this again a little bit later. And again, it is not anti-Semitic. It is not trying to derail the Jews in any respect as an ethnicity. It's just simply talking about the fact that they have become persecutors. And no one can deny that the book of Acts makes it very clear that some of the most hostile people toward the church in the early centuries were the Jewish people. But there were plenty of Jews who also accepted the gospel. So it's not really about ethnicity in that case, but rather one's disposition toward God and toward his word. And that's why in verse 9 that statement is written that way. It might sound wrong to us, it might raise an eyebrow or two, but that does not make it illegitimate. Because you'll notice there he also says that they're blasphemers, that they actually, through their deeds and through what they're saying and doing, they are showing that they don't care about God and that they're dishonoring him by the way that they live and the way they act. That they're not obedient, they're not doing anything right, they are instead going after Satan, who is their true master in this particular case, because of their deeds and because of the way they're trying to live their lives. So that's one element of the persecution here in Smyrna. You have a significant hostility from the Jewish people in this place against the church, and it's likely, as we see in the book of Acts, that they were trying to rally the Roman Empire to persecute the church as well. We see that in Acts chapter 17, that you have in Thessalonica, a lot of the Jews get together to attack the church, and they even tell the Romans that they have caused a lot of problems and ought to be punished for it. That's likely what's happening in Smyrna as well. We also notice in verse 10 that Satan himself is causing even more suffering. So it's not only these Jewish people who are causing a problem, but in verse 10 we note here, the devil is about to throw some of the Smyrnians into prison so that they might be tested. So the trials that they're facing are significant. They're facing a ton of hostility. They're really being persecuted intently. And yet, Jesus is encouraging them to go through this, to put up with these sufferings and these persecutions, and to not be discouraged by what's taking place. And so what Jesus does here as he's talking about all of this, showing his knowledge of the situation, he's trying to encourage them and comfort them to understand that although these things are happening and although they're not happy or comfortable, that they can overcome. Notice in verse 10 what he says. Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. So yes, there was some suffering in their future. They were going to be having some hardship. It doesn't go into detail about what that would be here except the detail about prison, but there might have been other things that were involved in that as well. And yet Jesus says, don't be afraid of this. Because you have me, you have my word, you have my power behind you, and although you suffer these things temporarily, it will not last. So the devil's going to throw some of you into prison, he says. Now, some commentators take that as a symbol of death itself. I don't think that's the case here. It is probably just talking about actually being put into prison, because the intent there in verse 10, it says, is that they might be tested. So the idea would be that they're going to have the opportunity to forsake their faith to avoid prison. So maybe that's what's going on here. But the idea they're going to have tribulation for 10 days is significant indeed. That is what tells us this suffering is going to be temporary. Now, it's not only that 10 days is a short period of time, just in terms of the grand scheme of life, but it's the fact that if you go back to Daniel chapter 1, so again, we have another allusion here to Daniel, but if you go back to Daniel chapter 1 of verses 12 through 15, you'll find that Daniel, in that very first chapter, when they refused to partake of the king's fancies, that is, the wine and the meat that he offered to them, which likely were associated with idols, that when they refused to do that, they had to eat vegetables and drink water, which naturally would mean they would probably not look as strong or as nourished as their fellows. And yet after 10 days, it was shown that they were actually stronger than those that were around them, and they looked to be even better to the king. So that may be coming into play here to say that although they're going to suffer for 10 days, that temporary period, they're going to come out looking even better at the end of it. That it might have a refining effect on them, and it'll have a testimonial aspect to the world around them to show who they are and what their faith really means. But there is also this detail in verse 10 that I want to make sure we notice. So although the suffering is going to be temporary, although they should be unafraid and should be encouraged by Jesus in this case, he does say this, be faithful until death. So even to the point of death, Jesus urges the Smyrnians to be faithful. Be faithful to him specifically, to not give up on him or his ways, to not forsake him in the hour of trial, but instead to cling closely to his side, knowing his promise, which at the end of verse 10 you'll see, I will give you the crown of life. Now, we think of a crown today, and we're likely thinking about the crown of a king. It has this very nice gold shimmer to it. It's got jewels that are in there. It's very fancy. It's very beautiful, and it symbolizes authority. In this particular case, though, this is not really the reference point. The reference point is instead to the wreath that one would wear at the end of an athletic competition where they have run in a race or competed in some other way, and the crown of life or the crown of victory would be given to that person as a symbol of their victory, of overcoming whatever trials they faced to reach the finish line. And that's what's in view there at the end of verse 10 about this crown of life. That's what they would have had in mind. Some do suggest that at basically the top of the hill in Smyrna here, it kind of resembled a crown. That's not really certain in this particular case if that's the reference, because we see the same language used all throughout the New Testament. So I would go more to the point that it's talking about the victor in an athletic competition, someone who has run a race and crossed the finish line and won it and received a prize as a result. That's likely what's in view here. But Jesus promises this to the Smyrnians. So he's saying that death is not going to really hold them. That yes, they might face death. They might legitimately be put to death for their faith. But guess what? They close their eyes in death and they open them up in glory. And they will see Jesus, who will bestow upon them this crown of life. And it'll be that token that shows that all that suffering and hardship they endured was worth it. And that same promise is applied to us as well. We know that if we are faithful to Jesus, we do his will, we strive to live for him to the best of our ability, he promises us the crown of life as well. That no matter how hard it's been, no matter how difficult our lives have been, that if we're faithful to Jesus, even to the point of death, he will reward us with the crown of life. Let's look at verse 11. So as we talk about the other part of the promise here, going right along with the idea of life and death, there's that admonition once again to pay attention to this. That one who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Pay attention to this is the idea. But the promise here is this: he who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. So this is significant. This is the first time we're going to see that language used of the one who overcomes. That's the idea of someone who is a victor. He has not allowed obstacles to hold him back. He has cleared all the obstacles, he has overcome all the hardships, and he has truly gained the victory. And here Jesus says, the one who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. This is introduced here in verse 11, and the second death is not even described in further detail until about chapter 20. We're going to find the second death being a spiritual death, a death where one is punished for eternity for the things they have done wrong. We'll talk more in detail about that when we get to chapter 20, so I'll just leave it at that for now. But you can understand why the second death would be so serious and why one would not want to suffer the second death. But Jesus says here to the Smyrnians that if they overcome, if they are victors, that second death, they don't have to worry about it. It's not going to affect them. They will never have to be concerned about it. They won't have to face it. They will instead have that crown of life. So the Smyrnians were suffering. They endured great hardships. They were being persecuted. They had many people pressing in on them, trying to cause them to fall, to no longer serve Jesus. Satan himself was present in all of this, trying to press in on them and get them to give up on their faith in Jesus, to turn their backs on him. But they would not. We don't know all that happened to them after this was written. We don't know if they heeded the admonition, ignored the admonition, or somewhere in between. But we know this, that for this congregation, they were not condemned not once by Jesus. And I think that says something very significant about these people, that he did not find fault with them as he did with the Ephesians, or he will with some of the others. But he does urge them to stay faithful. He encourages them to that end and reminds them that if they stay faithful, there is a reward that is promised. Just as there is a reward promised to all those who are faithful to Jesus, who submit to him, obey his ways, and see it through even to death. They don't give up. They don't put their hand to the plow and then look back and think they should go back and do something else, but instead they remain with Jesus. They don't give up on him. They do his will to the best of their ability. That's all we have to say about the church in Smyrna and the sufferings that they were enduring and what Jesus has to say to them. And so we have a bright spot among the seven churches. So Ephesus was a bit of a mixed picture, whereas with Smyrna, it's a bit more clear-cut, a bit more straightforward. As we move forward, we're going to see a little bit more of the complicated pictures where there's some good things, but there's also a lot more bad things. So we'll be looking forward to our further conversations, and we're going to talk next week about Pergamum or Pergamus, depending on what your translation says regarding the name of that city, and we'll resume our conversation from there. As always, I thank you for your time and attention to this. I hope it has clarified some things about the church in Smyrna and what Jesus has to say to them, but we'll conclude right there. Thank you so much for your time.